Well, quite soon we'll find out, but there are very big questions still out there for me.
Neither of them knew that the woman standing beside the field that day would one day become his sister-in-law's rival. Neither of them knew that a man watching from the sidelines, a cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles, was already tangled in a relationship with someone else in the royal family entirely. Camilla and Anne's 50-year story didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened inside one of the most rigid, tradition-bound institutions on the planet. And to understand why a rivalry over one man could last half a century, you have to understand the world these two women were born into. It began in 1970, on a polo field outside London, with two people who had no idea they were about to reshape the royal family for the next 50 years. Camilla Shand was 22. Charles, the future king, was 21. Some accounts place their introduction at a polo match in Windsor Great Park, arranged, of all things, by a mutual friend. Royal commentator Robert Jobson later described what struck Charles about her immediately. She was completely unbothered by the weight of royal life around her, and she carried a sharp, mischievous sense of humor that most people in his position rarely encountered. Neither of them knew that the woman standing beside the field that day would one day become his sister-in-law's rival.
And I don't think either of those two would have been able to cope. They'd been anywhere else. And that was the only good thing that happened, was that they were there.
Neither of them knew that a man watching from the sidelines, a cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles, was already tangled in a relationship with someone else in the royal family entirely. Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, second child of Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, and, at that moment, quietly involved with the very same man Camilla had her eye on. This wasn't a simple love story. This was a collision course. But before we go further into what happened that day, you need to understand who these two women actually were. Because both of their family histories explain almost everything about what followed. Let's start with Camilla. Camilla was born in July of 1947, the eldest of 3 children. Her father, Bruce Shand, was a decorated army officer turned businessman. Her mother, Rosalind, came from the Cubitt family, aristocratic, well-connected, comfortable in rooms most people never enter. But it was her mother's side that mattered most on that particular afternoon in 1970. Camilla's great-grandmother was a woman named Alice Keppel. And Alice Keppel wasn't just any ancestor. She was the mistress of King Edward VII, Charles's own great-great-grandfather, for over a decade, right up until his death in 1910. Think about that for a moment. 2 generations before Camilla was born, a woman in her direct bloodline had already been intimately entangled with the British monarchy. Alice Keppel had been discreet, socially brilliant, and trusted by a king. She had quiet influence that stretched into government and diplomacy. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of woman who understood how to survive inside royal circles without ever holding a title herself. Camilla grew up hearing those stories. And according to biographers who've studied this closely, Camilla used that history the moment she got close enough to Charles to use it.
I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was.
She reportedly introduced herself with a line referencing that very connection, drawing a direct thread between her great-grandmother and his great-great-grandfather, and suggesting, with a smile, that they had something in common. It was clever. It was calculated. And according to people who studied her closely, it wasn't an accident. Because at the exact same time, Andrew Parker Bowles, the man Camilla had been seeing on and off, was involved with Princess Anne. Some royal historians believe Camilla's approach to Charles wasn't just attraction. It was retaliation. Royal author Penny Junor has spent years researching this exact period. According to her research, Camilla was, in her words, passionately in love with Andrew Parker Bowles. But his wandering eye, and his relationship with Anne, pushed her past her limit. Junor has described it as a tit-for-tat situation. Camilla, hurt and furious, turned her attention toward Charles almost as a form of quiet revenge. And there's a detail here that rarely makes it into the polished version of this story. One that says more about Camilla's state of mind at the time than any polo field conversation ever could. According to reporting on this period, Camilla once caught Andrew Parker Bowles being unfaithful. And in her anger, she didn't simply walk away quietly. She slashed his tires.
There's always been a major ambition, and it's a...
And she left him a message, written in lipstick, directly on his car. That's not the image most people have of Camilla today. Calm. Composed. Steady beside the king. But history rarely lines up with the version we're shown in the present. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Hi viewers, have you ever felt like someone in your family never really forgave another person, even decades later? Drop a yes or no in the comments. Because that question sits at the center of everything you're about to hear. Now let's talk about the other woman at the center of this story. Because Anne wasn't simply the Queen's daughter standing quietly in the background of someone else's romance. She was, in her own right, one of the most driven, most disciplined figures the modern monarchy has ever produced. Anne was born in August of 1950 at Clarence House, the second child of the then Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. She grew up largely raised by nannies, her parents frequently travelling, frequently occupied with duties that would only grow heavier once her mother became queen 2 years after Anne's birth. She was educated first at home, then sent as a boarder to Benenden School in Kent. And from an early age, one thing about her became clear to everyone around her. She did not enjoy being looked at, fussed over, or treated delicately. She wanted to work. And began her first official royal engagement at 18 years old, opening an educational centre in Shropshire in 1969. That was the beginning of a work ethic that would eventually make her a defining figure of the institution. She also had genuine, hard-won athletic talent. She competed as an equestrian, winning gold in the individual event at the 1971 European 3-day event championship, riding a horse she'd bred herself. That same year, she was voted the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, beating out professional athletes for the honour. In 1976, she became the first member of the British royal family ever to compete in the Olympic Games, riding her mother's horse, Goodwill, in equestrian eventing at the Montreal Games. This wasn't a woman playing at royal duty from the sidelines. This was a woman who understood competition, discipline, and pressure on a level most of her family never had to. So when Andrew Parker Bowles ended things with her to marry Camilla in 1973, the wound went deeper than a broken romance. It cut against everything Anne valued about herself. Loyalty. Steadiness. Earning your place through effort rather than charm. And here's where the story turns. Reports from people close to the family suggest Anne didn't take time to process that loss quietly. Instead, she moved fast. She became engaged to a fellow equestrian, Captain Mark Phillips, that same year, and the wedding that followed, held at Westminster Abbey in November of 1973, was watched by an estimated 100 million people worldwide. Phillips was offered an earldom for the marriage. He turned it down. Because of that decision, their 2 children, Peter and Zara, were born without royal titles at all, a detail that would later shape how normally, and how publicly, both of them were able to live their lives. Some historians believe the speed of that engagement wasn't love. It was momentum. It was the need to prove something to herself, and maybe to everyone else watching. Meanwhile, just months earlier, Camilla had married Andrew Parker Bowles in a lavish ceremony at the Guards Chapel in London. 800 guests attended. It was called the Society Wedding of the Year. And here's a detail that rarely gets mentioned, but that tells you everything about how tightly wound these lives already were. Princess Anne herself attended that wedding. So did the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret. So did the Queen Mother. Read that again. Months, maybe only weeks, after her own romance with Andrew had ended, and stood inside the same chapel, watching him marry Camilla. Royal duty required her presence. Royal duty didn't ask how she felt about it. That's the part of this story people forget. These weren't strangers orbiting each other from a distance. These were 2 women forced, again and again, into the same rooms, the same ceremonies, the same photographs, no matter what history sat between them. Now here's where the story widens, because Camilla and Charles didn't disappear from each other's lives after that. Far from it. According to Penny Junor's own research, after that brief early romance ended and both of them married other people, Charles remained drawn to Camilla in a way he never quite explained, even to himself. Junor wrote that Charles knew Camilla was flattered by his attention, but that he understood, even then, he could never marry a divorcee. The rules of the institution he was born into simply wouldn't allow it. And so their connection didn't end. It just went quiet. In 1974, Camilla gave birth to her first child, a son named Tom. Charles was asked to be his godfather. Think about that arrangement for a moment.
As to the broader picture of how something like this could have happened.
The man who had once courted his mother would now stand as a permanent, formal presence in her son's life, watching him grow up from the closest possible distance a royal godparent can occupy. By the late 1970s, Charles and Camilla were reportedly still seeing each other periodically, even as both of their marriages continued around them. Photographs from 1979 show the two of them together in public, only 2 years before Charles would marry someone else entirely. Because in 1978, at his own birthday party, Charles met a young woman who would soon become the most photographed person on the planet. Lady Diana Spencer. Diana was young. She was aristocratic in a way Camilla, despite her family's connections, technically wasn't. And to the public watching from outside the palace gates, she looked like precisely the kind of bride a future king should have. Charles and Diana married on the 29th of July, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral. It was called the wedding of the century. An estimated global audience in the hundreds of millions watched Diana step out of her carriage in a dress with a 25-foot train, watched the two of them kiss on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, watched what appeared, from every camera angle available, to be a fairy tale beginning. But behind that fairy tale, Camilla never actually left the picture. Reports from this period, later reinforced by Diana's own accounts, describe a marriage haunted almost from its earliest days by a third presence neither invited nor acknowledged publicly. Diana herself would later describe her marriage using a phrase that became instantly infamous. "There were 3 of us in that marriage," she said, "so it felt crowded." That line wasn't metaphor. It was aimed directly at Camilla. For over a decade, the public didn't fully understand what was happening behind palace walls. But insiders did. And slowly, painfully, so did Diana. Meanwhile, on the other side of the family, Anne's own marriage was quietly unraveling too. And the way it unraveled adds a strange, almost eerie parallel to what Camilla and Charles were going through at the very same time. In the mid-1980s, a naval officer named Timothy Lawrence was appointed equerry to Queen Elizabeth II, an aide role that placed him inside the same tight orbit as the royal family's daily life. Anne and Lawrence began to know each other there, not as strangers meeting at a ball, but as two people working the same long hours in the same corridors. By 1989, their relationship had deepened into something more, all while Anne's marriage to Mark Phillips was, by most accounts, already breaking down. That same year, a British tabloid revealed the existence of private letters written from Lawrence to Anne, stolen and leaked to the press. Buckingham Palace was forced to issue a formal statement acknowledging the letters existed, calling them personal correspondence between the Princess Royal and a friend. Read that carefully. 1989. The very same year the infamous Camillagate recording between Charles and Camilla was made, even though it wouldn't become public for another 4 years. 2 royal marriages, quietly rotting from the inside, in the very same year, involving 2 women whose lives had already been tangled together for over a decade. Anne and Phillips formally separated that same year, and divorced in April of 1992. By December of that year, Anne had married Timothy Lawrence in a quiet ceremony at Crathy Kirk near Balmoral, choosing the Church of Scotland specifically because, unlike the Church of England at the time, it permitted the remarriage of divorced people. Only around 30 guests attended. It was about as far from her first wedding's 100 million-person audience as a royal marriage could possibly be. And some royal observers have suggested that was exactly the point. Anne had learned, the hard way, what public spectacle could do to a marriage. By December of 1992, the strain across the entire family had become impossible to hide. That same month, Charles and Diana announced their separation. And 1 month later, in January of 1993, a British tabloid published something that would embed itself permanently in royal history. A transcript of that intimate telephone call between Charles and Camilla, recorded back in 1989. The scandal became known, almost immediately, as Camillagate. The tape was invasive in a way that shocked even seasoned royal reporters. People could call a phone number and listen to the actual recording. Private, intimate conversation exposed to the entire country and eventually the world. For Camilla, the fallout was brutal. She became, almost overnight, one of the most publicly vilified women in Britain. She was blamed, loudly and repeatedly, for the collapse of what the country had been told was a fairy tale marriage. She was booed at public appearances. She reportedly had eggs thrown at her car. Newspapers ran headlines calling her the most hated woman in England. Camilla later described, in a rare interview years afterward, how she coped with that level of scrutiny. She said she needed to find a way to live with it. Nobody likes being looked at constantly, she said, and criticized constantly. But eventually, she said, you learn to rise above it and get on with life. That's worth sitting with for a moment. A woman who had once slashed her first husband's tires in a jealous rage was now being forced to publicly absorb the anger of an entire nation, quietly, without complaint, for years. Meanwhile, Charles and Andrew Parker Bowles, remarkably, had spent years as friends despite everything simmering beneath the surface. But by 1995, after 22 years of marriage, Camilla and Andrew finally divorced. That same year, following the wreckage of her own marriage, Queen Elizabeth II made a decision of her own. She wrote to both Charles and Diana, expressing her view, supported by Prince Philip, that a divorce was now in the family's best interest. Charles and Diana's marriage officially ended in 1996. Then, in August of 1997, everything changed in a way nobody could have anticipated. Diana died in a car crash in Paris. The public grief that followed was unlike anything the monarchy had ever experienced. And in the middle of that grief, Camilla's position became almost impossible. For years afterward, she remained largely out of public view, allowing time, quietly and deliberately, to do work that no statement or apology ever could. It took years. Careful, incremental years, of low-key public appearances, of measured silence, of letting the public slowly adjust to her presence beside Charles again. By 2005, that slow rehabilitation had reached its conclusion. Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a televised Anglican blessing at St. George's Chapel. She became known, at that point, as the Duchess of Cornwall, deliberately avoiding the title so closely associated with Diana. For nearly 2 more decades, Charles and Camilla appeared together at royal events, supporting Queen Elizabeth through her final years, gradually becoming a fixture of stability within a family that had weathered scandal after scandal. And it was during this same stretch of decades that her relationship with Princess Anne, quietly, carefully, continued to hold its old chill. You have to understand what royal life actually looks like behind the palace walls. It isn't just formal photographs and waving from balconies. It's proximity. It's forced closeness. It's spending decades standing beside people you'd rather never see again. Anne and Camilla were bound together, whether they liked it or not. Family events. State occasions. Christmas gatherings at Sandringham. Every single one of them, a reminder of what had happened years before. And according to insiders speaking to royal publications over the years, Anne made her feelings clear without ever raising her voice. She was described as cold, distant, unapproachable when it came to Camilla. One insider put it simply. There was bitterness. Old bitterness. The kind that doesn't fade just because time passes. Some sources even claimed and made it known she had no intention of ever curtsying to Camilla. Not out of rudeness. Out of principle. Out of loyalty to a wound that never really scarred over. And it wasn't only Camilla who felt that chill. Interestingly, Anne's relationship with Princess Diana wasn't warm either. Reports describe her as standoffish toward Diana too, uninterested in the media storm that followed her everywhere. This wasn't personal cruelty. This was a woman who valued tradition, service, and privacy above almost everything else, watching two very different women marry into a family built on discretion. But Camilla was different. Camilla wasn't just an outsider marrying in. Camilla was the woman who had once been tied to the same man and loved. Meanwhile, Camilla's own marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles had lasted 22 years. 2 decades of shared holidays, family functions, and unavoidable royal circles, all while an old rivalry sat quietly underneath the surface, waiting. Nobody spoke about it publicly. Nobody had to. The tension didn't need headlines. It lived in something smaller. A look held a beat too long. A greeting kept a little too brief. A room that felt just slightly colder whenever both women stood in it. For years, that was simply how things were. Distant. Careful. Unspoken. But there's a strange twist buried inside this story, one that most casual observers miss entirely. Despite everything, Andrew Parker Bowles and Princess Anne never actually stopped being friends. Long after his marriage to Camilla ended in divorce in 1995, Andrew remained one of Anne's closest companions. The two of them shared a lifelong passion for horses, and they continued showing up together at events like Royal Ascot and the Cheltenham Festival, decade after decade. It gets more personal than that. When Anne's daughter, Zara Tyndall, was born and chose Andrew Parker Bowles to be one of her godparents. Think about the weight of that decision. This wasn't a passing acquaintance. This was a woman placing the man once tied romantically to her own history into a permanent, symbolic role inside her child's life. Some royal historians believe that friendship never fully faded because, on some level, Anne never fully let go of what she and Andrew once had. A pause here, because this detail deserves it. Camilla's ex-husband. Anne's old flame. Godfather to Anne's daughter. Woven permanently into both women's lives, whether either of them wanted him there or not. And here's something that makes the entire arrangement even stranger. Even after Camilla's own divorce from Andrew in 1995, and even after her eventual marriage to Charles a decade later, Andrew Parker Bowles remained on cordial terms with Camilla too. He didn't vanish from her story either. He simply became a permanent fixture at the edges of both women's lives, a quiet reminder neither of them could ever fully escape. History has a strange way of circling back on itself. And this time, the entire world would be watching. What happened next didn't just reopen an old wound. It forced a 50-year-old rivalry to finally answer a question neither woman had ever wanted to face: who really belonged at the center of this family, and who would always be standing just outside it. The title question arrived in September of 2022, in the days after Queen Elizabeth II passed away. And it landed on the royal family like a test nobody had studied for. Camilla was about to become queen. Not queen consort. Queen. For most people watching from outside the palace gates, the distinction sounded small. A formality. A word choice. Inside the family, it was anything but small. It's worth noting that Queen Elizabeth herself had actually addressed this exact question publicly, months before her death, during her Platinum Jubilee celebrations in 2022. She stated it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when the time came for Charles to take the throne. That statement, from the monarch herself, gave Camilla's eventual title a level of protection few could publicly challenge. But protection from public challenge isn't the same as private acceptance. According to royal insiders, Princess Anne was reportedly uneasy about the title change. Not because she doubted Camilla's dedication, but because titles inside a monarchy are never just words. They're structure. They're hierarchy. They're a signal to the entire country about who stands where. And Anne, more than almost anyone else in that family, understood structure. She had spent her whole life inside it. By this point in her life, Anne had attended more than 20,000 official engagements since beginning royal duties in 1968. She had served as president of Save the Children since 1970, over 5 decades of continuous involvement. She held patronage or honorary leadership across more than 300 separate organizations. Year after year, official statistics tallying royal engagements placed her at or near the very top of the list, often surpassing family members decades younger than her, culminating in 457 individual engagements in a single year alone. If anyone respected the weight of a title, it was her. So when the conversation turned to whether Camilla should be queen outright, sources say Anne had questions. Quiet ones. Careful ones. But questions nonetheless. Here's what makes this moment so fascinating. This wasn't a stranger challenging Camilla's rise. This was a woman who had known her, resented her, and quietly measured her against the same scale for 50 years. Hi viewers, quick question for you. Do you think titles and hierarchy actually matter in families, or is that just outdated tradition? Yes or no in the comments. Because that question was about to be answered in front of the entire world. There's another layer to this that rarely gets discussed. Some reporting around this period suggested there had even been a genuine disagreement between Camilla and members of the wider family over how the title question should be handled, with royal designer David Emanuel, the man responsible for Princess Diana's wedding dress, later claiming there had been real tension behind the scenes. Palace officials never confirmed the details. But the fact that outside observers, people connected to the family's inner circle for decades, were picking up on friction tells you something important. Whatever was happening wasn't just public speculation. It was being felt. The coronation was set for May 2023. Cameras from every country on Earth would be pointed at Westminster Abbey. And somewhere inside that carefully choreographed ceremony sat 2 women whose history together stretched back further than most of the staff working that day had been alive. On the 6th of May 2023, both Charles and Camilla assumed their full sovereign titles in a ceremony the country hadn't seen in 70 years. Camilla was formally crowned queen that day, wearing a crown originally made for the Queen Mother, a deliberate, symbolic choice meant to tie her to the institution's continuity rather than to controversy. Charles, meanwhile, was doing something his father's generation rarely did. He was speaking publicly, and warmly, about his wife's role. He praised her steadfast devotion to duty. He wanted the country to see Camilla the way he saw her. Not as a scandal from decades past. Not as the other woman in a story that had already caused so much pain. But as a partner who had earned her place. That framing mattered. Because it placed Anne in a difficult position. She could hold on to old resentment. Or she could accept what the rest of the family, and the rest of the country, appeared ready to accept. I want you to sit with that for a second. 50 years of frost. 50 years of cold greetings and careful distance. And now, an entire nation asking her to stand beside the woman at the center of it, smiling, in front of every camera in the world. The tension didn't explode. It never does, not in this family. It settled instead into something quieter. A watchfulness. A waiting. Because here's the thing about royal resentment. It rarely disappears. It just changes shape. And the shape it took next surprised almost everyone who had followed this story for half a century. By early 2024, everything shifted again. Not because of a title. Because of something far heavier. Health struggles hit the family hard and fast. In January of 2024, King Charles underwent a procedure to treat an enlarged prostate. Camilla was photographed by his side as they left the hospital together. Weeks later, the king's own cancer diagnosis was made public. Around the same time, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was dealing with her own diagnosis. Suddenly, the machinery of the monarchy, the one that runs on scheduled appearances and quiet reliability, was short-staffed at the exact moment the public needed reassurance the most. Camilla stepped forward. Not reluctantly. Not as a placeholder. She stepped into a heavier public role, carrying more of the institutional weight than she ever had before. And here's the part that changes everything you thought you knew about this rivalry. And noticed. She wasn't watching a rival anymore. She was watching someone show up, day after day, the same way she always had. The same discipline. The same refusal to complain. The same quiet insistence that duty comes before comfort. For a woman who had spent her entire life measuring people by exactly that standard, it was impossible to ignore. Pause on that for a moment. 50 years of bitterness. And it wasn't an apology that started to dissolve it. It wasn't a conversation. It was simply watching someone work. Sources close to the family describe a shift, subtle at first, in how Anne began speaking about Camilla. Less ice. Less distance. Something closer, though still guarded, to respect. Body language experts who studied the two women during this period noticed something too. Judy James, who has analyzed royal behavior for years, pointed out that despite their long history, Camilla and Anne appeared to be finding a place of mutual understanding, driven less by personal warmth and more by a shared instinct to protect and support the institution they both served. That distinction matters. This wasn't friendship in the way most people think of it. It was something more practical. More royal. A recognition that the family needed both of them functioning, not fighting. But old wounds don't vanish just because circumstances change. Because underneath all of it, Andrew Parker Bowles was still there. Still part of both of their lives. Still, remarkably, close friends with each of them individually. He and Anne shared decades of friendship built on horses and racing weekends. He and Camilla shared 22 years of marriage and everything that came after it. Two women. One man threaded permanently through both of their histories. You'd think a bond like that would make things more complicated. And for years, it did. But something was changing. Something none of the royal watchers had predicted. The image that stopped everyone in their tracks came in September 2022, during the Queen's funeral. Cameras swept across Westminster Abbey, capturing world leaders, foreign royals, and grieving family members. And there, seated beside each other, were Princess Anne and Camilla. Not across the aisle. Not carefully separated by protocol. Side by side. For anyone who had followed this rivalry for 50 years, that image alone was the story. Two women who had spent decades in careful, deliberate distance, sitting together during one of the most solemn moments the family would ever share. It wasn't a headline. There was no statement. No interview explaining what it meant. But it meant everything. Because here's what I need you to understand about royal relationships. The biggest moments rarely come with dramatic confrontations. They come in silence. In small gestures. In seating charts nobody thought to question until years later. That funeral wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a very different one. And what happened 2 years later would close the loop on a rivalry that had outlasted marriages, decades, and even the Queen herself. November 2024. A ceremony at the University of London. Formal robes. Academic tradition. The kind of event that rarely makes headlines outside its own small world. Except this one did. Because the person presenting an honorary award that day was Princess Anne. And the person receiving it was Camilla. An honorary doctorate of literature, handed directly from one woman to the other, in full public view. Think about what that moment actually contains. 50 years earlier, these two women had been locked into a quiet, unspoken rivalry over the same man. Frost at family gatherings. Careful distance at royal events. A rumored refusal, decades old, to ever curtsy. And now, one of them was standing in front of the other, offering recognition. Respect. Formal, public respect. Witnesses described the two women as looking closer, warmer than anyone could remember. I want to be honest with you about what this story actually teaches us. It isn't really about Camilla. And it isn't really about Anne. It's about how long resentment can survive inside a family built on obligation. How two people can circle each other for half a century, through weddings, through scandals, through a death that shook the entire world, through leaked letters and leaked tapes in the very same year, and still, eventually, find their way to something like peace. Duty did what apologies never could. Andrew Parker Bowles, now in his 80s, remains close to both women to this day. The man who once stood at the center of their rivalry never fully left either of their lives. And somehow, that fact stopped being a source of tension and became something closer to shared history. A thread connecting two women who had spent decades trying not to look at each other too closely. Here's the truth about royal families that documentaries rarely say out loud. They don't heal the way ordinary families do. There's no long conversation over dinner. No tearful reconciliation captured on camera. Instead, there's simply time. Duty. Proximity. And eventually, grudging, quiet acceptance. 50 years, from a polo field in 1970 to a graduation stage in 2024. Two women who never asked to be tied together, bound instead by the choices of one man neither of them fully let go of, and by a family neither of them could ever fully step outside of. And somewhere in that unlikely, decades-long orbit, something resembling respect was built. Not because either woman wanted it. Because duty demanded it, and in the end, duty was the only thing strong enough to outlast the bitterness. But this is only one piece of a much larger picture inside that family. Because while Camilla and Anne were slowly rebuilding trust in public, another relationship inside the same household was quietly falling apart behind closed doors, one involving a different sibling, a different title, and a rift far harder to repair. That story is coming next. And once you hear what really happened, you'll understand why some royal wounds heal and others never do.